Anyway, the assassination of Milk and Moscone. That is a strange, strange episode. I'm going to do another stream at some point about how we're like in a weird, they say that the generals are fighting the last war. Have you ever heard that expression? Generals fighting the last war. Like the beginning of the US Civil War was like the Revolutionary War. And then the end of the US Civil War was like World War I. They had trench warfare and machine guns. But for the first beginning of the American Civil War, they were kind of refighting the War of 1812 or the US Civil War or the American Revolution. Right. And that it's an expression. Generals, they're always fighting the last war. They're always going over their head. What did they do wrong in the last war? And then they like reposition it. And the 1970s, the late 70s, we're talking 1978, 1979, 1980, there was a fight in the ruling class. And the fight was between the oil bankers and the Rockefeller Eastern establishment and the lower levels of capital in the military industrial complex. And Reagan represented the lower levels of capital and the military industrial complex. But in order to be allowed to do his thing, he had to bring Bush in as his vice president. And so he had to already compromise with the oil folks because Bush was an oil man from Connecticut and former CIA director. And then right after Reagan, was like a far right industrialist, military industrial complex guy. But then right after Reagan took office, he was shot and Bush assumed the presidency briefly. And after that, it became clear that Reagan, he could do his right-wing strongman thing a little bit, but he couldn't go too far with it. But Reagan, the rise of Reagan to some degree or other represented a kind of an upsurge of the military industrial complex against the Rockefeller Eastern establishment, against the big oil bankers. And that was a fight that was going on. And Jimmy Carter, he brought in almost everyone from Jimmy Carter's cabinet, came from the Trilateral Commission, which was a think tank that was set up by David Rockefeller and the Rockefellers, and they employed Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And they set up the Trilateral Commission, and they wrecked the U.S. economy. They put people in at the Federal Reserve who got rid of all the regulations around lending. It used to be that local states in the United States had what are called usury laws. And usury laws were laws that made it illegal to charge too much interest. The idea was that it was not moral. They call it theft, right? I mean, if you lend somebody money, but you make them pay back like, 200% interest or something, that's criminal, right? That's just not moral. You're taking advantage of the fact that the person needs to be lended to, right? There's that song by Woody Guthrie, I'm a jolly banker, so give me back 2 for the one I lend you, because I'm a jolly banker am I? Right. And local states around the country had laws that said you couldn't do that, right? You couldn't charge huge amounts of interest. Well, the U.S. Congress under Jimmy Carter passed a law and made state usury laws illegal so that you couldn't regulate interest rates. You couldn't have usury laws. He did all kinds of things that wrecked the economy. He pushed the Malthusian degrowth stuff really, really hard. When there was an energy crisis, he got on TV and told Americans they should wear sweaters instead of turning up the heat if it costs too much. And he told Americans they should just be poorer, right? That owning things and having things isn't going to make you happy. I'm Jimmy Carter, and he was very much a degrowther, and he went after his own party. Right. There was a faction in his own party. They called them the Smokestack Democrats. And they were labor union guys. Most of them were Roman Catholic. They were Italian, mostly Italian and Irish guys. They were close to the Teamsters Union. They were pro-labor guys that were usually in urban areas, and they were pro-labor union. And they wouldn't go along with this. And they supported nuclear power, and they were trying to raise the living conditions. They called them smokestack Democrats, or, industrial Democrats. They were like old Roosevelt Democrats. And Jimmy Carter framed them all up with the FBI. They had ABSCAM, which stood for Arab scam. They hired an FBI guy to dress up like an Arab sheik and try to bribe him. And there was one case where there was some senator, they actually tried to bribe the guy, and he pushed the suitcase away and said, no, I don't want this. And they still convicted him of bribery. And they just purged the Democratic Party of these pro-labor Democrats in order to pave the way for for the degrowth stuff. But anyway, that was the backdrop. And this fight was waging among the bourgeoisie. And I actually gave a class at our retreat in Kansas at the Lynn Valley Training School. I gave a class on like the transition from Carter to Reagan and like all the things that were happening. So many things were happening. It was a very wild, wild moment. I made a timeline. It's like, holy shit, the amount of things that were going on. But one thing that happened was San Francisco. So San Francisco was a very important place in the political legacy of the 1960s. First thing first, San Francisco is where you had Ramparts Magazine. You folks know about Ramparts Magazine? Ramparts Magazine was it started out as this like kind of liberal Roman Catholic magazine. But all of a sudden it turned into the New Left magazine. It was the magazine that promoted the Black Panthers. It was the magazine that promoted Maoism and communist China. And this magazine from the Bay Area, it was kind of an obscure magazine, Ramparts. It just went everywhere. And it was a magazine that, that really a lot of the big names of the New Left worked for Ramparts. No one would have ever heard of Eldridge Cleaver if it wasn't for Ramparts Magazine. Eldridge Cleaver was this man who'd been convicted of rape. He was serving time in prison for rape. And he started writing letters to Ramparts Magazine. And Ramparts Magazine started publishing his letters about racism. And then Eldridge Cleaver came out of prison and became like a Black Panther. Right? He was a convicted rapist who was in prison writing letters about racism, and Soul on Ice is the letters that were published in Ramparts Magazine. Very odd. Ramparts Magazine hired Bob Avakian, the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party, right? That was his job. That's how he started out. He was just employed by Ramparts Magazine. On top of that, they hired David Horowitz, who's now an awful right-wing guy. He's a neocon. But David Horowitz, back then, he was a leftist. His parents were big Communist Party members, and he was the editor of Ramparts Magazine. So it was very strange. It was this magazine that just kind of blew up, and it was one of the main publications. And people read Ramparts all over the country. And so Ramparts Magazine, it was the New Left magazine, right? It like people read it in New York City. Like it was just this big, yeah, I'm getting to it. Hold your horses. So San Francisco was like ground zero for the New Left, the 1960s New Left. That's where the free speech movement happened at Berkeley. That's where the Black Panthers started in Oakland. So like San Francisco, which is, that's Northern California, major city in the United States. That's a dock port city. That was where the New Left, the 1960s political movement got going. So San Francisco is a very important city. As the 1970s went on, the New Left started to have political influence in San Francisco. And they elected two politicians to office who were Bernie Sanders-ish, I guess you could say. The first one was the mayor, George Moscone. George Moscone was he's probably far to the left of any mayor of a major city we've had in recent years. I mean, he was a social democrat. I mean, he wasn't a communist, but he was a social democrat. He was a friend of the labor unions. He was a kind of a populist, pro-labor. He was like a Dennis Kucinich kind of figure. He was a very far left mayor, George Moscone. And in addition to that, they elected the first openly gay elected official, Harvey Milk. And Harvey Milk was also a leftist. Back then, if you were openly gay, you were a leftist because most of America was against homosexuality. But he was left. George Moscone and Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk was, he was a gay rights activist. And he ran for city council on a platform of supporting labor unions. He got, San Francisco. First of all, why was San Francisco like the gay mecca during that time? Well, it actually started out during World War II. If you got kicked out of the U.S. military for being gay, they would drop you in San Francisco. And that was common during World War II. If they caught, then it was, the military, it's all men and men are together. And if they caught two guys being gay in the military, they would send them both to San Francisco and give them a dishonorable discharge. So San Francisco was where they would drop gay people. That continued during the Korean War, the Vietnam War. So because San Francisco, if you were fighting in Vietnam or fighting in the Pacific and you got caught being gay, they dropped you in San Francisco. The memo started going out that San Francisco was like the gay city, right? And still now San Francisco is very gay, but like San Francisco, because it was like, you know, it was a major city on the East Coast, a lot of US military stuff there, a lot of gay stuff. So San Francisco was like a kind of a gay place. New York City is on the East Coast. That's where all the gay people were back in the 70s. And in San Francisco, that's where all the gay people were on the West Coast, right? You know, like the Village People, right? You know, the Village People are the big gay disco group in the 70s, right? They're in YMCA and all of that. But they're the Village People for Greenwich Village in New York, and they have a song about San Francisco, right? And they even have another song about like, let's go west, go west. You know, I mean, it was, you know, there was Francisco for gay people on the West Coast, and New York City was for gay people on the East Coast, right? So, so San Francisco was this, you know, this very, very gay city, and a lot of gay nightclubs and gay bars, etc. And so Harvey Milk, he got all the gay bars to boycott the beer. There's a beer that was non-union. Like I think it was Coors. It was one of these beers that was hiring non-union labor. And so there was a boycott that the unions were calling of this beer. And he got all the gay bars to boycott this beer that was non-union. So, you know, that was kind of his rise in popularity. He was a pro-labor union gay activist. Okay. But what you have to remember is that both George Moscone, the liberal mayor of San Francisco, and Harvey Milk both got support from something called the People's Temple. Do people remember the People's Temple? That's Reverend Jim Jones. And the People's Temple was this religious cult that was in San Francisco. I don't want to use the word cult, right? The word cult has no meaning. It was this very, very authoritarian, hierarchical, cohesive, abusive religious organization in San Francisco. I'll put it that way. I don't want to use the word because that's a meaningless word. It was a very abusive, hierarchical, authoritarian religious organization in San Francisco, led by Reverend Jim Jones. And Reverend Jim Jones, he was calling himself a communist at that point. He claimed he was both a Christian and a communist. He claimed he was the combined reincarnation of both Jesus and Lenin in one, you know, sent to America to save the black people or something like that. You know, and it started out in Indiana, and then they were in another part of California, and Jim Jones was living in San Francisco, and he was this big leftist, and he would bring his church to big anti-war protests, and he was just this well-known pastor in San Francisco. He was a white guy from Indiana, but his church was mostly black people. But he would recruit some white people into the church as well, but it was mainly black people. Like he would recruit white leftists, but it was mainly black people, low-income black folks from Oakland and other places. And he was this big pastor who had a very, very authoritarian and notoriously abusive church. And so Jim Jones, you know, he would suck up to politicians, right? That was his kind of his strategy. And so he sucked up to George Moscone, and he sucked up to Harvey Milk by having his religious church members do campaign work for the two of them for free. They campaigned for George Moscone for free. They campaigned for Harvey Milk for free. And all of Jim Jones' church members, which there were many of them, they would campaign for these, you know, politicians for free. Right. And so with the free campaign labor of activists from the People's Temple and all of that, Harvey Milk and George Moscone got elected. Now, what happened was that after George Moscone was elected, let me add, Dianne Feinstein was also a politician in San Francisco during this time. She ran against George Moscone in the election, arguing that George Moscone was far left. She said he was a radical, he was a socialist, he was an extremist. She was a more sensible Democrat. She was like a centrist Democrat. She ran against George Moscone and she lost the election, right? Dianne Feinstein lost the election to George Moscone, the far left candidate. And so George Moscone was the mayor. Harvey Milk was the first openly gay elected official. And so then, because it was pretty clear that, another thing, George Moscone appointed Jim Jones to be the housing director of San Francisco, the guy who was in charge of public housing. So Jim Jones is not only this pastor who thinks he's the reincarnation of both Jesus and Lenin combined and is sent to earth to save the black people or whatever. Now Jim Jones is also claiming that he's he's got a title. He's like a government official. He's the head of the housing bureau, right? He's the head of the public housing of San Francisco. So at that point, because of the fact that George Moscone was a liberal and was pretty far left, and Harvey Milk was pretty far left, and that they had appointed Jim Jones, the head of the Public Housing Bureau, Republicans and moderate Democrats started digging up dirt on Jim Jones. And there's plenty of dirt on Jim Jones, right? The guy was not a good dude, right? And I'm not going to get into detail about it, but Jim Jones was not a good dude, okay? One of the beliefs of Jim Jones' church was that everyone was homosexual deep down, and so like he would have sex with men in the church, like help them realize they were homosexual, right? And he also believed that women were all homosexual deep down, so he would have sex with them to help them realize that to help them overcome their homosexuality. A lot of wild things were going on in the People's Temple. It was a really unhealthy organization, a lot of abuse, a lot of unhealthy things were going on, and that happens. I mean, there's abuse in organizations. There's unethical practices. So Jim Jones was notoriously unethical, and so because he was starting to have a lot of power in San Francisco politics, and he'd aligned with George Moscone, and he'd aligned with Harvey Milk, Jim Jones was, being exposed in the media for his unethical practices. And so Jim Jones took his followers to Guyana. And then we know what happened in Guyana. A member of Congress went down to Guyana to visit it, and they killed a member of Congress, or somebody killed them, and then there was the mass suicide. So 1978, you had the mass suicide in Guyana, right? Very famous incident where all of Jim Jones' cult members, they all drank cyanide, and some of them were shot, and it was a horrendous incident. So what a lot of people don't realize is that it was just 2 weeks after the Jonestown mass suicide, just 2 weeks later, that George Moscone and Harvey Milk were assassinated. And that chain of events makes their assassination very interesting, right? Because if you think about it, the guy who got them elected, there's a mass suicide that's shocking the world in Guyana. And then 2 weeks later, they get killed. They were shot in City Hall by a former police officer who snuck in through a window and killed them. And then he only got like a 2-year, 3-year prison sentence because of the Twinkie defense. He said the junk food made him do it, right? He was mentally ill, and junk food made him very mysterious. And then who got to be the mayor after Dan White? Yeah, it was Dan White. After Dan White killed George Moscone and Harvey Milk, who became the mayor of San Francisco? Dianne Feinstein. So yeah, it's pretty shady. You look at the details there. That is extremely shady. Extremely shady. That is extremely bizarre. Something not right is going on there, and we don't know what exactly, right? I mean, people talk about MK Ultra and Jim Jones, but to be fair, Jim Jones also had a relationship with the Soviet Union. I mean, that was pretty clear. I mean, he was very much in with the Soviet Union, and Angela Davis was very friendly with Jim Jones. If you want to piss off Angela Davis, somebody's got to interview Angela Davis someday and ask her about what Jim Jones was like. See what she says. I would love to hear that, because Angela Davis went over to Jim Jones' apartment. She spoke that Jonestown, they would play her over the big loudspeakers at Jonestown. Angela Davis and Jim Jones were buddies. No one ever talks about that, right? That's one way, I would love to interview Angela Davis sometime and ask her about that, because see what her reaction would be. Because, I feel like she would rip the mic off and walk right out of the room probably. But, Angela Davis and Jim Jones were hanging out. They were good friends or something. Pretty wacky, pretty weird. But you'll never hear any of the people. Now they all love Angela Davis. They all love Angela Davis. And I will say this, right? Angela Davis, to her credit, right? You have to give her credit, right? For the fact that she was the main spokesperson for the Communist Party during the 70s and 80s. Gus Hall was pretty old during those days. She was the main spokesperson, and she defended East Germany. She defended the Soviet Union. She defended Cuba, and she was on trial for her life. However, people ask questions about her ties to the Frankfurt School. I mean, she got her education. All of her academic work started out with the CIA, with the Frankfurt School. That's a little weird, right? So what was going on there? Like, all of her academic work is tied to a CIA-linked false Marxism called the Frankfurt School, right? Herbert Marcuse and all of that was being funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and that's where she got her education. That's pretty weird. And she quit the Communist Party as soon as the Soviet Union fell. She betrayed the Communist Party. She was one of the biggest supporters of Gorbachev, and she stabbed Gus Hall in the back, and she split the Communist Party. So, she did good work pretty clearly, right? During her youth. I mean, during her time leading the Communist Party, and even now, she will defend the Soviet Union in speeches. She will defend East Germany, but at the time the Soviet Union was being dismantled, she was supporting the people who dismantled it. She has roots with the Frankfurt School and with the CIA. So there's questions there. And now she's awoke. One thing that infuriates me is when, like, I was tweeting at Vaush about, if he said all tankies are Nazis, I said, what about Angela Davis? And I had all these idiots tweeting at me, Angela Davis is an anarchist, you idiot. Angela Davis would never support the Soviet Union. Oh my God, you must be retarded to think Angela Davis was a tanky. Angela Davis was definitely a tanky. She supported North Korea. She supported Cuba. She supported all those countries. In the 70s and 80s, she was on Soviet television very frequently. She was she was the main public spokesperson for the Communist Party USA, and she held the line. She gave their line, So, people, so now she's awoke, right? Interesting. I want to read that, John. I want to read that. I didn't know about that. That sounds like something I should read on this stream. If you can find me the text of that, John, I think about reading that on this stream. I got to read it first, but that's fascinating. I did not know that about Maria Butina. Maria Butina wrote a letter to Angela Davis. Oh, shit. But anyway, that whole thing, if you look at the chain of events, Jonestown mass suicide, assassination of George Moscone, assassination of Harvey Milk, Dianne Feinstein becomes mayor. And the guy who then killed them gets acquitted. All of that is really weird. And that San Francisco, look, there was a lot of deep state stuff going on in San Francisco in the 70s. That is just a fact. And I'm not saying who was working for who, but there was a huge amount of deep state operations going on, right? And that, that there was, it's pretty clear that, that the CIA and the liberal CIA tends to be based in California, right? The Stanford Research Institute, Marilyn Ferguson, and Silicon Valley. That's the liberal CIA. California is their territory, right? In Marilyn Ferguson's screed, The Aquarian Conspiracy, she said, America is free, but California is freer. Like that. I mean, California is very, very much, that is the liberal CIA's territory. But that said, it's also pretty clear, San Francisco was the center of the Maoist movement, right? I mean, that's where the Maoists were. The October League, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, the Communist Party USA Marxist-Leninist. San Francisco, for some reason, California was all about Maoists. There were Maoists like crazy out there, and the Black Panthers were out there. There's speculation about influence of Chinese intelligence, that the FBI was convinced that the Chinese government was funding people in San Francisco, and that there's a big Chinese American community in San Francisco. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, if you read the FBI files from that period, which are public, you can read them, COINTELPRO documents, they are convinced, if you read it, that they're convinced that the Chinese intelligence agencies are walking around and funding everything. And for all we know, they might have been. I don't know. I mean, it's possible. I mean, Gaddafi gave support to the Black Panthers and stuff. So is it possible that, that China had some influence in San Francisco, had a foothold or something? It's possible, right? We don't know. But, I mean, it appears, that the FBI believed that Chinese intelligence was operating very heavily in San Francisco. It's also believed, there was also some deep state versus deep state stuff going on, because California, you have to remember, California, who was the governor of San Francisco for most of the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, was Ronald Reagan, right? And Nixon was from California, right? So there was, like, on the one hand, San Francisco, this hotbed of the synthetic left and the liberal CIA and Congress for Cultural Freedom and MK Ultra. I mean, Haight-Ashbury is where the CIA is distributing the LSD. All the LSD experiments, MK Ultra, Operation Chaos, that's all happening in San Francisco. Meanwhile, the governor is Ronald Reagan, who's a hardline conservative. Richard Nixon is from California. There was deep state stuff going on, right? And we don't really know to what extent what was going on. How much was Jim Jones MK Ultra? How much was he in with the Soviets? How much was, and then, also there was some counter ganging stuff going on, right? And this is one thing that I've heard about, right? Is that in San Francisco, it was pretty clear the mainstream left was being supported by the CIA. That's documented, right? That the LSD was being distributed by the CIA, that, the Congress for Cultural Freedom and Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, the mainstream left was being supported by the CIA. But a lot of counter gang groups at that time. There were a lot of Trotskyist groups. Again, I'm so obsessed with history. I would sit these old communists down and just talk to them and learn from them. And people told me about how during the 1970s, in San Francisco, you would have a communist meeting. There'd be a communist event about stopping the war in Vietnam or whatever. And, like, crazy Trotskyites with masks and baseball bats would come and beat you up and, like, smash up the meeting for being a Stalinist meeting. And, like, these communist groups were fighting with each other. It was like FBI versus FBI. I mean, it was like there was a lot of, like, weird deep state stuff going on, right? Where, like, one communist group would have a meeting about stopping the war in Vietnam, and another communist group would show up with chains and baseball bats and weapons, and they would charge it on the grounds that it was like a fake communist group. That kind of thing happened, right? And at that point, it's pretty clear that, like, there's one intelligence agency that thinks that, that this meeting is run by some other intelligence agency. That there's deep state stuff like that going on, right? And that there were a lot of very small communist groups operating in San Francisco that were very violent, right? That's where the Symbionese Liberation Army was. The SLA, do folks remember the SLA that kidnapped Patty Hearst? They were in San Francisco. That's where they started, right? It was like 5 people led by Don DeFries. And and that there was a huge amount of, like, radical organizations, people calling themselves communists or anarchists or Marxists, with guns, with weapons, kidnapping people. There were assassinations, there were bombings, and leftist groups were fighting other leftist groups. There was a lot of chaos going on. And you had Jim Jones doing his thing. And amid all of that, you had George Moscone and Harvey Milk, and then you had, Jonestown, and then the assassinations. And, it's funny because it's like, I'm talking about this now, right? About, like, well, communist groups violently attacking other communist groups and all of this. It reminds me of two things. First thing it reminds me of is the years of lead, right? In Italy, they talk about the years of lead. And that's when it seemed like Italy was going to vote for the Communist Party. In the 60s, it seemed pretty clear that Italy was moving into electing a communist government. And so, to mess things up, the CIA created chaos in Italy, and they started giving guns and weapons to fascists to assassinate communists. And they also started giving guns and weapons to Maoists and Trotskyites and ultra-leftists to engage in terrorist violence, to, like, discredit leftists and cause chaos. And in Italy, in the 1960s and 70s, Italy was in complete chaos because there were a bunch of extremist groups and weapons and all kinds of stuff. They call it the years of lead, Operation Gladio, right? It was a lot of confusion, right? Writing it down. So there was a lot of confusion going on. And the intelligence agencies, the deep state, they were fighting with each other, right? That military industrial complex, Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon wing of the deep state, was fighting against the Eastern establishment. Silicon Valley was starting to get set up in the late 70s. The computer revolution was just getting going, right? And And I've talked to people who lived there. There was a woman that I knew that I worked with politically, I won't say where, who had been in San Francisco during these years. And she'd been in one of the Maoist groups. She'd been in a Maoist feminist group. And she told me she remembered when People's Temple would participate in the big parades. They had big parades, like big anti-war demonstrations. And she said she remembered People's Temple because People's Temple would march. And she said what she remembered was they would have traditional African drums and crowds of white and black people like dancing together. And people just knew them as some church. And they would march in all the parades. They were just some church that was anti-war, that was mixed race. And they would have African drummers and people of both races, black and white, dancing to the African drummers. That's what people knew People's Temple to be. And she said, when we heard what became of it, that was utterly terrifying because we just knew them as some church, which is interesting. The other thing is that I'm trying to remember. I mean, the Bay Area. I mean, all kinds of stuff was going on. There was a communist group called the Democratic Workers Party, which was like a Maoist feminist group that operated in San Francisco. And was very big, and there's a whole story there. You can read about Marlene Dixon and the Democratic Workers Party and what was going on there. The Black Panthers were in the Bay Area. That's where they started, in Oakland. There was all kinds of stuff going on, and it was a lot of confusion. It reminds me of the Years of Lead in Italy, except there wasn't as much death, right? There wasn't as much killing. I mean, maybe if you include Jonestown, but for the most part, there wasn't as much, straight up killing. A lot of violence between these communist groups beating each other up with chains and baseball bats, shooting at each other. And on top of that, it reminds me of now, right? With the Proud Boys, with Antifa. We all know this is FBI versus FBI, right? This is deep state versus deep state. This is CIA versus CIA. It's now proven that Enrique Tarrio was an FBI informant, the head of the Proud Boys. He was like an FBI informant, and that the deep state has embedded itself in the Proud Boys. You can bet the deep state has embedded itself in Antifa, and that they're not just embedding themselves to get information and stuff. They use these groups. There are deep state agendas, right? And that especially when groups are very violent, this is Sorelianism, right? The goal of a communist group is to put forward a program and mobilize the broad masses of people to advance the interests of the working class. But George Sorel said, no, we have to have very isolated groups that engage in acts of violence, right? And that's what counter gangs are. They're Sorelian formations. They're very isolated groups. Their beliefs are very, very, very extreme, very, very extreme. Right? They only accept people that will, give the whole of their lives and completely obey and not have a mind of their own. And they're used not to mobilize the broad masses of people, but rather to carry out operations, right? And that's Sorelian counter gangs, right? And that if you look at the way a lot of these groups in the 70s operated, they weren't trying to appeal to the broad masses of people. They were trying to build some kind of Sorelian formation that would engage in violent operations that would somehow advance some kind of deep state agenda. And that's why I have so much admiration for what was called the new communist movement. The Maoist groups, for the most part, the October League, the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Workers' Party, they actually tried to reach the broad masses of people. They did. If you read Revolution in the Air by Max Elbaum, if you read Heavy Radicals or Threat of Greatest Magnitude by Aaron Leonard, you can see that the Maoist groups, that broke with the Weathermen, that came out of Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, the October League, the Communist Workers' Party, the Communist Labor Party of Nelson Peary, those groups, they actually were trying to get to the masses. They were repudiating the hippie movement. They didn't use drugs. They had short hair in a lot of cases, and they were trying to get to the masses. They got jobs in factories. They were trying to do what you're supposed to do, and they realized that the hippie movement was not good. They realized that that the socialist countries of the world were not in line with the hippie counterculture, and they were trying to build something like what CPUSA had been in the 30s. They were not successful, because the U.S. economy was still so strong, but they had good instincts. And so I encourage people to go read the old documents of those organizations. Read the Red Papers, the founding documents of the Revolutionary Communist Party. Go read the Red Papers. Go read stuff by the October League and all of that. Because you'll see a group of people that are trying to do the right thing. They know what the right thing is. They're just doing it in hostile territory, right? And I talk about the Boston trap and other things, and that, I mean, we need to study the new communist movement of the 70s is worth studying. It's very tragic. It's a great defeat. It's defeat after defeat. It's a demoralizing time. But that time period, the new communist movement from like 1969 to about 1982, 83, 84, that was a period where there was a significant block of people, tens of thousands of people, who were trying to be serious communist organizers in America. And they were giving it their all, and they were organizing, and they were trying to reach the broad masses. They weren't trying to do the hippie thing. They were doing out of the movement to the masses. They didn't call it that, but they got out of the movement, out of the hippie movement, and were trying to get to the masses. So, there's a lot we can learn from that period. But yeah, the whole that moment, in a lot of ways, the Carter presidency was like a weird truth and reconciliation moment for the 60s. Right? Jimmy Carter pardoned all the draft dodgers, not draft resistors, right? If you were somebody who refused to fight in Vietnam and went to jail, he didn't pardon you. He only pardoned people who had fled to Canada. And he made a deal that if you had fled to Canada, you would come back to the United States. He pardoned draft dodgers, people who went to Canada, not draft resistors, right? And Jimmy Carter did the Church Committee that investigated and revealed the crimes of the FBI and CIA. The Church Committee, the Congressional Church Committee, was just revealing COINTELPRO, revealing MK Ultra. That got into the public record because of the Carter administration. And it was very much the Carter administration was trying to kind of heal the wounds of the 1960s, right? Jimmy Carter met with gay rights activists. He was the first president to meet with the gay rights activists. He sponsored a feminist conference, spent millions of dollars to sponsor this big conference about feminism, to set a women's agenda in Texas. Jimmy Carter was very much he was a new left president. And while he was doing all these kind of woke things, he was also waging a war against the labor movement in his own party and pushing degrowth really hard. The White House issued the Global 2000 report, arguing there are just too many people in the world. So it was a weird period. And then towards the end of the Carter presidency, you had the Iranian Revolution, you had the U.S. economy in shambles and like a nightmare. And then you had this kind of revolt by the military-industrial complex, and a lot of weird things were happening in that period. That's the period where David Duke comes out of, too. David Duke, right? He's the big Ku Klux Klan white supremacist guy. He came out of the woodwork in the late 70s, and suddenly he was on national television talking about being a Ku Klux Klansman, and they were having him on Donahue, and he was going around the country. You watch Black Klansman, the Spike Lee movie. It takes place during this period when David Duke, out of nowhere, the government, it's pretty clear the government to some degree or other, the FBI and the government, was working with David Duke to try and build the Ku Klux Klan as kind of a counter gang. 1979, the Ku Klux Klan assassinated 5 members of the Communist Workers' Party on television, on live TV. It shot them, right? And David Duke was kind of rebuilding the Ku Klux Klan to be this like underground group that was like doing volunteer work for the FBI, cooperating with the COINTELPRO program, and weird stuff was going on. So it was a very strange period. A lot of deep state stuff was happening, I guess. And I could ramble about that all day, but there you